Reminded one I read about one time in the middle of World War II, before the United States had entered the war, the German troops were coming up on the northern part of France and were pushing into the northern part of France, where France separated from Great Britain by the English Channel. And we're pushing up to a place called Dunkirk, which you can still visit and see some of the damage from World War II there. There's almost 400,000 British and French troops that were kind of captured there. They were pushed up against the English Channel. They couldn't retreat any further, and here came the German troops pushing them, and there was no place for them to go. In the middle of that whole battle that was going on there, some of the troops from Great Britain sent a message to England through wire. And basically they just said, "and if not." Now, that might not mean a lot to many people. In fact, many of you maybe have never run across that passage, but it's from this text we're looking at this morning. What it meant was, it was taking a picture from this passage in Daniel 3, and it means we're up against the wall here. German troops are coming here, and we will fight to the man to the death, even if we all die here. And if we are not rescued, we will still commit ourselves to dying here on this beach. Quite a commitment. It led to one of Churchill's famous calls to action, and the British people came together, and they called together every ragtag little ship, every little sailboat, every pleasure craft, every kind of thing that would float to cross the English Channel and try and get some of these soldiers off of the beaches there. They thought that they may rescue maybe 42,000 soldiers. They ended up rescuing 388,000 soldiers in that endeavor. Now, we look at that and say, well, we're not fighting a battle like that, not in a war, but we are fighting a battle. And this passage in Daniel 3 gives us a great lesson of what it means when we are confronted with life and it doesn't look like it's going the way that we would like. Now, if you've been with us last 2 Sundays, we've been looking at the book of Daniel. We looked at, first of all, as Daniel and his 3 young friends were taken captive from Israel and brought up to Babylon when Nebuchadnezzar came in and conquered the nation of Israel. They were then set in a special school, if you will, to be leaders of the country of Babylon, to be invested in the service for Nebuchadnezzar the king. These young men were very young, probably 10 years, 14, 15 years old, something like that. And the first message we looked at 2 weeks ago tells us that Daniel and these other 3 men, it says they made up their mind in the very beginning that they were not going to be defiled by all that came along with the nation of Babylon, especially in the food and everything, because there wasn't something that was offered to God. And so they early on determined who we're going to follow, who we're going to live by. Then last week we looked at the fact that just like those 4 men, everybody's got to make up their mind you're going to serve somebody. You're going to bow down and serve the world forces like they were asked to do then, or we're going to serve God. Same choice for every man or woman who wants to follow Jesus Christ. We're going to have to serve somebody. There's no in between. There's no DMZ. You're going to serve God or you're going to serve the world, one or the other. And so then today we want to look at a continuing saga as this begins to develop for us in the book of Daniel and see what God has for us. So first of all, I'm going to look at our dilemma, and I'm saying our throughout this whole process because I believe even though we look at this historical story that went on, we can see that it's a dilemma that each one of us face. So in Daniel chapter 3, it begins this way. It says, "For this reason at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews." Now, let me back up and give you a little setting first. Remember in chapter 2, we saw that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And he had this dream of this great statue that came down out of the sky and had 4 parts in the statue. And it says the head was gold, and said the shoulders were silver, the thighs and the trunk part was bronze, and then the feet were made out of clay and iron. And he said, well, what's this mean? And Daniel said, well, let me give you the meaning of that. And he said, here's what God told me the meaning of this statue is. He said, Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold. And then there will be an empire, a kingdom that will come after you. And that will be made up not of gold, but made up of silver. And we know now that from the successive ways that the world empires came, there were world empires that came in succession after Babylon. We know that Babylon was the empire led by Nebuchadnezzar. We know that they were taken over by what we now call the Medo-Persian Empire. And then we know that the Greek Empire took over from that, and finally the Romans. And so we have this idea, there was this visage came to Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel interpreted it for him. And then in that visage, there was this, it says almost like a flying, it says a stone that grew great and came out of nowhere and came and smashed the statue and completely destroyed it, and then grew into a kingdom, it says, it would last forever. Now, we didn't get into the prophetic implications of that, but I believe that's an implication of the fact that God's kingdom will establish itself over all the kingdoms of the earth, and that's the prophetic picture that we have there. So that's the background. Now, in chapter 3, most people would look at, if you piece some of the information together, say this is somewhere between 20 to maybe 23 years later, depending on how you look at the different kings and when they came to power and when they were serving and all that. So 20-some years later, now we have Nebuchadnezzar not having a dream, but Nebuchadnezzar also involved with another statue. This statue wasn't a dream. This statue is one that he made himself. And we find the statue, he says, was 90 feet high, 60 cubits, 90 feet high, 9 feet wide. So that's kind of a long, narrow thing. Probably is on a base. And then so it's this huge statue of Nebuchadnezzar himself. And it was overlaid with gold. Gives us some kind of idea about why in the world would a guy do something like that. It was very possibly, and I think that probably makes some good reason, because he might have been reflecting on this idea, okay, this previous statue is gold and silver and all these other things. Well, you know, I'd kind of like my empire to last forever. And so I'm going to build this statue of myself and make it gold. There's not going to be anyone that would succeed me. We don't know, but it's certainly a demonstration of a great ego that wanted to build this great big statue. So in chapter 3, verse 3, he gathered all the leaders together. And remember, he said he had the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers. That's like saying, okay, in our country it'd be the president and the leader of the Senate and the leader of the House of Representatives and governors and mayors and the sheriff's department. All of them would get together. So that's what it got together. So I'm going to get all these people together, and I want you to come. I'm going to invite you to come in to the dedication of this great statue. So we saw last week, when you get these invitations, it usually ends up in much more than that, and that's why we have to make these determinations. But now, some of these determinations start to have a little bit more ominous ring to them. Look in verse 8. So then it says, for this reason at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. So what's the problem? Why would they do that? So the statue's built. So I'm going to call all these people together, and these people together come and he said, I want you to bow down, I want you to worship the statue. And then these leaders come together and said, you know, we've noticed something here, these Chaldeans. Chaldeans just means Babylonians, it's just a synonym for the same group of people. They said, we noticed there's certain people among us not doing that. And they said there are certain Jews among us who are not bowing down. Now, whether that was one of the earliest ethnic taunts, we don't know. Very well could have been. The Jewish people have always had those kinds of reflections against them as a people, and this is another example of it historically. These Jews are not going along with the program here. They're not bowing down. We also know there's probably a part of some just what we would call the office politics, because we also know that 20-some years before this, when Daniel and 3 friends had been brought into Babylon from captivity, they stood out, and they literally ended up being almost the leaders of the class. And because they ended up excelling and being so good at what they were doing, Nebuchadnezzar, because they interpreted his dream, he put them to the top of the class. So 20 years later, it's very possible this class jealousy, had taken place. Nobody likes the guy who's at the top of the class, right? Oh, he's kind of egotistical. Who does he think he is? That kind of thing. So that's probably also something that was going on. Now, when we come to this place, we find that Daniel isn't there, possibly off on some other kind of business, but we find this just centered on these 3 men. And remember that we said in 1 Kings, it says that there were 10,000 young men that were taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar. And again, we ask if there were 10,000 Jewish men taken out of Israel and brought into captivity in Israel, where were the other 9,996? Well, evidently they weren't following God the way that these three men were. So it does pick up this idea of standing alone. So here they are. Daniel's off doing something because he does come back in the picture. So he hasn't run away, but it's just these three are settled out of this. So here you've got these tattletales. These guys are going to rat these guys out and said, King, did you notice there are certain people over there that are not doing what you wanted them to do? Certain people are not bowing down. And so they brought them before the king, and the king has a little discussion on this, and maybe you didn't understand. Let me just give you the benefit of the doubt. You see the big statue? When all the music starts, so we're going to prep this so when the music starts, everybody's going to bow down, okay? Everybody, all together now. 1, 2, 3. Let's all bow. So you see that there's a problem there. There's a problem there because the three young men knew Scripture. The three young men knew that God said, you won't bow before anybody other than the one true and living God, especially any statue or any idol. You're not going to have any idols before God. So, no, we're not going to bow down. Well, you can imagine how that sat with Nebuchadnezzar in verse 13. It said Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. And so he says, probably knowing them, because again, had this long history by this time, these guys had excelled in their studies and were some of the leaders of his kingdom, said, okay, guys, is it true? I mean, surely you guys understood what I was saying. Possibly had some affection for these young men and had seen them grow and serve him well, and so he knew them, and so there must be some mistake. So in verse 15, he said, okay, now everybody ready? Now if you're ready, everybody together now bow. Just a little nod will do, no big thing. When you hear the music, everybody just bow. So you can imagine what that did with these young men. These young men did not do that. That was the dilemma that they were in. He didn't want a lot, just a little bow. It reminds me of another time when Jesus was asked to bow. Remember that in the New Testament? Taken to the wilderness by Satan. And Satan said, listen, you see all these kingdoms of the earth? Like they were his to give. He said, if you bow down to me, I'll give you all these kingdoms. And I don't know what it means to bow down. I think all it means is probably just to acknowledge the power of the person asking somebody else to bow down. So maybe it was genuine reflecting of the knees. Maybe it's just an acknowledgement. Maybe it's just a little bow, That's all that's necessary. Just to show some kind of deference to me, to show that you recognize my position of power over you. So maybe it's not a lot, but these young men wouldn't do that. Verse 15 moves on to say, Nebuchadnezzar said, well, just do this. Remember, first it comes as an invitation. Now look where it goes. Do this, or what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? What God is there who would deliver you out of my hands? You see, that points out the areas. Now you look at that and you say, no, I thought I remember back in chapter 2, last week, John, you said that after the king had a dream and he asked all the guys to interpret for him. They said, okay, tell us the dream. He said, well, you have to tell us the dream first. And he said, no, I'm not going to tell you what I dreamt. I want you to tell me the dream and the interpretation. And they said, well, there's nobody who can do it. There's no God on earth that can do that. We're educated and we've got all together, but we can't do that. Remember, the king then was given the information. Well, there's this guy from Israel, this kid Daniel. He could do it. So Daniel comes forth, so there is a God who can do that. It's the God that we serve. So he gives interpretation. When Daniel finished giving that interpretation, remember what the king did? The king said, listen, I want everybody to acknowledge this God is the true God. And I want everybody to acknowledge him, the God of Daniel, who interpreted this dream. So it gave great deference to Daniel's God. Now you look at that and then you compare that with this and say, what happened? My friend, it shows me that it's possible for somebody to come and have some kind of an observation, get a head belief. Okay, that's a cool thing. You can have your God interpret this dream. And so I'm going to have everybody acknowledge that God. But 20 years later, what does he say? He'd lost it. He really didn't believe in that God. We'll find out next week that was true about his life. He didn't believe in him. You know, when Jesus confronted a group of people in John chapter 8, it says that when he gave them a chance to hear what he had to say, it says they believed, but by the end of the chapter, it said they were ready to throw him off of a cliff. It tells me that there's ability that mankind has to have some kind of a head knowledge without a true change of heart. That's evidently what was happening there. You see, it's important for us also to realize what's going on here. This isn't just a nice little Bible story, not just a little Sunday school story. These events really happened, and they're there for our benefit. The book of Daniel is written for many different reasons, and this is one of them to help us understand how do we live in this kind of a world. And so we may not be asked to bow down to a given idol of any form like a statue or something, but we are asked to cave into the world system in which we live, correct? James Boyce, a pastor, former pastor, he's gone to be with the Lord now, had cancer a number of years ago and died. But he said this about what this means and how we relate to these kinds of situations. He said, let me say at this point, so that we will understand the story at the proper level, that this is the problem that confronts every follower of the true God when the requirements of serving him come into conflict with the demands of the secular state. I mean by this, not merely a demand to do an openly wicked thing or die for refusing to do it, like refusing to turn over or kill Jews in Nazi Germany in World War II. He said, I mean any pressure to disobey the teachings of the Bible, whether by peers in your school or by fellow employees or by your employers or by whoever it may be. Whenever you are pressured to do something or not to do something that you know by the teachings of the Bible to be wrong or to be right, whichever the case may be, your situation is that of these three men, and your responsibility before God is the same also. You must do what is right. You must not bow to the world's demands, even if the consequences are costly, end quote. So you see, Boyce has hit the nail right on the head. This isn't there just for us to say, no, it's a Sunday school story. This is one of God's principles. It's one of his teachings for all people who would say they're following Christ. All people say, I've made up my mind, that's who I'm going to throw my lot in with, and I'm going to serve God. Well, if you make up your mind to do that, sooner or later, you're going to be asked to bow down before some kind of an idol. You're going to be asked to acquiesce to some kind of world system that's against God. That's just the way it is. There's no middle ground. And remember that the time to wrestle with this question of am I going to bow down and worship this ideology, this philosophy, this worldview that everybody else is touting, is not when you're confronted with it, but it's beforehand. Daniel made up his mind, 14 years old. That's what I'm going to do. That's who I'm going to follow. And he decided early on who he was going to serve. That's when we wrestle with these questions. If we get to the place where all of a sudden we're asked to do them with it, oh no, they have this thing going, and I know God says this, and how am I going to handle this? So it does help us to understand that we should decide these things beforehand. So we look at this and say, well, how are we to react to this dilemma? That's a fundamental question, isn't it? It's a fundamental question to ask, what causes something this? Is this a normal expression? Should we expect something like this in our world? Aren't we told to love our neighbor? Aren't we told to obey those in authority over us? Are we friends or foe with the people in our world? Let me just respond to this by saying we understand several things from Scripture that help us to know how we are to respond to something like this. First of all, we have to understand the world. By that I mean the world system. If you're not following God, you're part of the world system. The world is hostile towards God. Romans chapter 5, verse 6 is the mindset on the flesh is death, but the mindset on the spirit is life and peace, because the mindset on the flesh is hostile towards God. So that's all you have. You have the spirit and you have the flesh. You have man, you have God. Again, no DMZ, nothing in the middle. You're going to follow God or you're going to follow the flesh. The flesh meaning your own natural inclinations and all the desires, philosophies, and all the ideas that mankind has. So mankind is hostile toward God. For it, in others, this fleshly impulse in every man does not subject itself to the law of God. It is not even able to do so. And those who are in the flesh cannot please God. That's quite a statement, Paul. Those in the flesh don't have a desire to because they're hostile towards God and they don't want to. They're not even able to. Now, it's a natural thing to look around at our world and say, well, if I looked at the magistrates and the prefects and the governors and all things that like they had then, does that mean all of them are overtly against God? Does that mean all of our family members and friends? Does that mean people at work? Does that mean everybody is antagonistic towards God? We have to understand that the Bible uses something which I would call common grace that shows that many people, in fact, most people live through the residue of Christian influences. And most people understand that their basic thing that God has given us in their conscience to know that are right or wrong. For instance, everyone knows that something in the heart of man knows it's wrong to murder, it's wrong to steal, it's wrong to rape. The Bible just says those are things which are in the conscience of mankind. So we get that. That's what I would call common grace. So we look at our neighbors, family members, and friends, and they will, well, they're not criminals. I mean, they're not overtly people posturing themselves against God. And so we understand that's the common grace. But the nature of those, the very nature of those who do not know God, who do not follow God, we have to understand, is set against him. That's just the way that it is with those who don't know him. Ephesians 2 says, and unbelievers indulge the desires of the flesh and are by nature children of wrath. That's the makeup of someone who doesn't follow Christ. That's their nature. You start talking about God and you push back, oh, I don't know about all this God stuff. That's a little extreme, isn't it? Well, I don't know about this Jesus stuff. That's nice for you guys, but not for me. Why? Because they're hostile towards God. They deny the existence of God. Romans chapter 1, this verse we've read a number of times, since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. So in that extension of what happens with mankind, Paul tells in that passage, that's mankind. It begins by saying they suppress the truth of God and unrighteousness. Then they put down these natural instincts that are in them, and because they put that down, they have to have some organizing factor about how they live life. So they come up with their own gods, their own philosophies, their own ideas, and they're thinking, well, here's what I think, and here's what my buddy at work thinks, and here's what somebody else thinks. We pull all together, and they, in essence, make their own religion. They make their own idols. So as a result of that, as Romans 1 continues on, it says that God gives them over. It's like God said, okay, if you want to do that, if that's what you want, have at it. Go to it. They deny the existence of God and make their own God, so God gives them over, it says, to the lust of their own hearts, gives them over to their degrading passions, gives them over to their depraved mind in three successive ways there. And then in verse 32, he ends up the passage by saying this, not only, so they deny God, what's in here, then they make their own gods, and so God gives them over, so okay, do what you want then. Then verse 32 he says, although they know the ordinance of God and that these who practice such things are worthy of death, not only they do the same, but they also give hearty approval to those who practice them. So they begin to look around at the world around and say, well, everybody else is doing it, and by the way, bless you, brother, go ahead. It's all okay, we're all in this together, and they become this collective force that, while may not look like they're against God, they're setting their mind and their hearts against God. That's the natural impulse. That's why the prefects and the governors and all that, that's why they would do that. That's why Nebuchadnezzar would make this idol. Didn't want to serve God, wanted people to serve him. That's the natural inclination of man without God. His unbridled fleshly impulses will reject everything that God stands for. It will reject everything that God stands for. Let me wade into some maybe dangerous territory, but I think it's appropriate this time. I'm going to just make what some people may think is a political comment. So you do what you want to with this. But you realize in our political discussion today, I'll just be so bold to say the Democratic Party today stands for practically everything that God hates. You can look at their platform. You can look at what they say. They hate everything that God stands for. They hate the exclusivity of Christianity. You've seen some of the discussions recently, even with regard to the Catholic Church. They hate the Catholic Church. I'm not saying the Catholic Church is the epitome of Christianity, but they hate a formalized religion. They hate babies in the womb. At the DNC convention this summer, what did they have in a rolling clinic right outside the convention center? They had a rolling abortion center. Come to the convention, almost like hawking popcorn. Hey, get your abortions right here, right outside. People reported seeing trucks pulling up there and taking away the refuse of what happened in that building. Several ambulances pulled up to deal with women who did not do well with that. They hate marriage. They hate God-given gender assignments. They hate the use of the sword to punish evil. Let's do away with all this. We don't need the cops. We don't need judges. Let's just let every man do what he wants. You see, the world demands that we bow at the altar of human consensus. We are told to get on the right side of history. We're told that we, Christians, are on the wrong side, and it's the world that has the supreme form of wisdom, so that even we had the last Supreme Court justice that was nominated in the court and is now on the Supreme Court of the United States, that can't even tell what a woman is. Now, if that's not upside down, I don't know what is. Now, I know some people come back and say, well, if I was in this situation for these young men here, what would many people today say? Well, we're to obey the government. So when the king comes and sends all of his prefects and all this out this edict, when you hear the music, bow down. That's what the government said, so we're supposed to do that. Let me just challenge that a little bit or flesh that out. I understand in Romans 13 we're told to generally obey government authorities, but we must remember this. Did God place Nebuchadnezzar in power? Yes, he did. Absolutely he did. Does that mean Nebuchadnezzar is God? Absolutely not. God has law and order in this world to keep a sense of what is civility in this world. Because without laws, without order, we would have chaos. And when the rulers step outside of God's desire for mankind, the Bible would indicate that mankind does not have an obligation to obey. I give you this example right here as a prime example. These three young men heard the edict of government and said, don't think so. As you go back when Moses was put in the waters to come and Pharaoh had to order all the babies to be killed because he was threatened by any baby to be born. The woman that was the midwife, it said, took the little baby and preserved the baby's life. Why? Because the government said kill it. Disobeyed government. You go in the book of Acts, when the rulers came to the ones who were preaching Jesus and said, you got to stop that. We're not going to have any of this Jesus talk. And if you do, we're going to beat you and put you in jail. And so the disciples said, what? You know what? We have to obey God rather than man. You see, this principle that is going on here is a thoroughly biblical principle. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego resisted the king. And Daniel did later. He ended up in the lion's den. We'll talk about that next week. So when we see these things, we need to understand there's a larger biblical principle that is overlaid over Daniel chapter 3, that where Jesus said this in Matthew 22, he said, listen, give to Caesar what Caesar does, give to the government what belongs to them. So what belongs to the government? You can go other passages and deal with it, but Romans 13 is a good passage to say, first of all, taxes. Sorry about that. The government has a right to tax, so pay your taxes. The government also has a primary right, and this is where our own government has gotten way past what God has designed for government to be. The government has the obligation to wield the sword for the punishment of evil. That's what it's there for. It's one of the primary responsibilities. Therefore, law enforcement, every law enforcement officer driving up and down this town or any other town in a black and white police car is an ambassador of God there for the purpose of putting evil down. And it's the same thing with the military. It's not to be, not to be imperialistic and seek other countries to conquer. If they do that, that's stepping outside of God's design. But when we see that the law is given for that, we have to understand that's how God intended. Give to Caesar that which belongs to him, but give to what? Give to God the things that belong to God. What belongs to him? His church. The law of God with regard to morality belongs to God. So even if I go no further than that, you have a very clear distinction between the responsibilities of government and the responsibilities of God. Now, so we look at this passage and say, are they disobeying God? No, I don't think so. No, we won't bow. No, we won't obey Nebuchadnezzar. No, we're not even going to just give a little nod of the head. We're not going to bow. Now you say, well, how does that work out? Well, even on a personal level, and again, I understand what I would call the common grace to all mankind. You know, we live in a society that's living on the residue of Christianity. I don't know if you realize that, the Christian principles in this country, we're still living somewhat on the residue of that. And so when we have these interactions with our friends and neighbors or family members, those that don't honor God, what's to be our reaction to them? 1 Corinthians 5, verses 9 to 11 gives us a clear understanding. This is a passage where it says that a man, and would this fit into modern society just perfect? It says a man had his mother. Whether or not it was his stepmother or his real mother, we don't know. But a man was having sexual relationships with his mother. Okay, I know, gross. Okay, but it was sin. And he was in the church. Now today, that would be lauded as something would be noble in many churches. But Paul has a very clear instruction to them. He said, no, that I want you to take care of this. I want you to look at this as something that steps out God's parameters. And in this relationship, you're not to countenance that. He said this, Paul said, I wrote you in my letter not to associate with immoral people. Now watch this. I did not mean with the immoral people of the world, or with the covetous, the swindlers, the idolaters. If you did that, you'd have to go out of the world. See, that's where a lot of us get our feelings wrongly placed. God isn't desiring that we leave the world. We live in a world that's filled with these, and you can make a whole nother long list if you want to. The immoral people, the covetous, the swindlers, the idolaters. That's the world in which we live. Because why? Because mankind without God makes up his own laws. Paul said, I didn't tell you not to associate with him, but then you'd have to go out of the world. But actually, he says, I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother if he's an immoral person, or a covetous, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or a swindler. Not even to eat with such a one. So the standard is for the church with those who call themselves Christians and yet act this way. Paul says you're to call them out. In fact, is if they won't repent of that, repent of that and turn, you don't even have dinner with them. So we have to understand this context. The Bible has this clear understanding that we live separately from this world system. James chapter 4, verse 4 says, listen, you adulteresses, that picture of adultery is used all the way through the Old Testament and somewhat in the New Testament, the picture of those that stand against God. Listen, you adulteresses, you need to know this. Don't you know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy with God. So on this governmental level, if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would have bowed, they're saying what? I'm not a friend of God. I'm a friend of man. I'm going to listen to man. I'm going to go along with what everybody else is doing. I'm going to be in the right side of this crowd. I'm not going to stand out and get their ridicule or even the punishment that they promised would come. I'm going to stand with them. My friend, we have to somewhat understand the world in which we live. We're not to be taken out of it, but we're not to participate in these kinds of things either. So that's kind of the dilemma they face. Now look at what they did with it. Look at their declaration in verse 15. So we understand that there's more to this declaration than just come, but it said they were to bow down or they're to be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And then he says, what God is there that can deliver you out of my hands? Now, if this were a movie, this would be a good place for Superman to come in, right? Or the cavalry would ride in and rescue them. But that's not the case. Here's this pompous leader telling people to bow down to this great statue that he's put up, or else you're going to be thrown into blazing fire. You think, well, what kind of a thing was a blazing fire? It was probably a huge kiln that was used to make bricks. Now, some people speculate that they kept that for all the people that would go against the edicts of the king. That's a little bit doubtful, but it could be. But it was probably just a kiln to make bricks. There's a huge, big pit, and that was one of the ways in which they fired bricks. and there would be a kiln built up around it, and they would probably operated by a huge bellows, and you know what wind would do, make it hotter and hotter. So it could have been they came and he said they were brought over to the fire and thrown them in, and then the guys that thrown them in, it was so hot they got killed. So you're talking about a super hot fire that was there, and said, this is the punishment for those who don't go along with the system. Now, we haven't gotten there yet, and we don't have fiery furnaces, but we certainly have persecution. We certainly have running up against the world system that will result in differences and opposition, sometimes even from family members and friends. Right, Art? Talk with Art about that today. So they make this declaration. What's their declaration? Look in verse 16. It said, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer concerning this matter." Now, that wasn't impolite. They weren't being, nuts to you. I don't think that was kind. They said, "No, I'm sorry. We don't need to do this." I'm sure Nebuchadnezzar might have stammered a little bit and thought, what? Look at verse 17. "If it be so, our God, whom we serve, because we decided back when we were young, this is who we're going to follow. The God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of burning fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king." That's quite a statement. Is that just as arrogant as his statement, say, "I don't want you to bow down"? Or they say, "No, we don't have to. Our God's going to deliver us." Remember Matthew 10, verse 28, Jesus said, "Don't fear those who can kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul, but rather him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." So the people that can damage our body when our soul is secure with him, Jesus said, in essence, don't worry about him because your soul's secure. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are ready to trust God in the face of the fiery furnace. And they say what? God is able to deliver us. Now let me just pause. I'm going to give you two sides of this, okay? First of all, we just ask, were they being presumptuous? Does the Bible assert God's authority? Can God deliver? Can I suggest a number of ways which we've seen in Scripture that God is in control, that God delivers? We know, first of all, in creation, Psalm 135, verse 6 says, "Whoever the Lord pleases, whatever the Lord pleases, he does, in heaven and on earth, in the seas and all the deep places." God delivers. God is in control of the world systems, rivers, oceans, skies, heavens. He's in control of that. He's in control of creation. We know that God is even in control of government leaders like Nebuchadnezzar. In Psalm 21:1, it says, "The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns her wherever he will." Up until this week, Sinwar was the leader of Hamas and caused a great amount of evil. But then he was taken out this week. God says, "You're a leader until I take you out." God's in control of that. We know that God is in control of the sufferings of Christ. In Luke 22, verse 42, Jesus said, "Father, if thou art willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but thine be done." Did God deliver Jesus from the cross? No. Did he deliver him up to do what he accomplished? To bring about the payment and the reconciliation for mankind for the sins of the world? Yes, he did. You go and make a whole list of things when you say, can God deliver? You have to say, yes, God can deliver. God is a strong God. God is in charge of creation. He's in all the effects of this world. He's in charge of governments. He's in charge of mankind. He is able. Why? Because we must understand man cannot deliver himself. I mentioned this in the first hour in our Sunday school class. Ann and I, in our vacation summer, we went to Hearst Castle, down on the coast, halfway down San Simeon. This Hearst Castle was built by William Randolph Hearst, this guy who was a multimillionaire and built this huge, big, almost looks like a European castle in the mid-coast of California. So we'd been there a number of years ago. You can take a bottom floor tour, and this time we wanted to go on the upper floor tour, so you go into his office, his study, the bedrooms, the personal bedrooms, so you can have that. Well, there was hardly anybody there that day, so Ann and I were the only two on that tour. And so the tour guide was very instructive, very personable, and we got to chat with her as we went through this whole tour for a couple hours or whatever. And at one point I said, "How long have you been doing this?" "I've been there for about 10, 11 years. Oh, well, what'd you do before that? She goes, well, we lived in Vermont, New Hampshire, somewhere like, I don't remember the exact state, and said I was a psychologist. Oh, what brought the change? She goes, she said something like real cool, almost under her breath, too deep and too wide, too big a problem. I couldn't deal with it. So you left there and came to California. That's a solution, right? So that's we saw this last weekend. The ways of mankind, the psychological systems of mankind can't deliver people. They don't have the right diagnosis, so they can't have the right prognosis. You can't tell what the what the problem is. So you can't tell what the solution is. So when they make their declaration, they can see that God is the one in charge, and they can make their declaration, King, we're not going to do this. So what does God do with that? So we see that not only do they make their stand, but we see that we look at his deliverance. So we can say, we make our stand, we make our declaration, we're with God, and we're going to stand with him. Then what does God do with that? So the two statements are made there. First of all, he says, he will deliver. Verse 17, it goes on, he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. Now we look at this. Did God deliver them? Yes, he did. You know the story. So just look, and it's interesting just to read this. So let me just read this and just to see what God did. Verse 19, chapter 3 of Daniel. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he answered by giving orders to the furnace to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain valiant warriors who were in the army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the blazing fire. Then these men were tied up with their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. So just in case you walk out, we're going to take your pants, and we're going to tie them around your legs, and we're going to take your cloak, and we're going to tie your arms, and we're going to throw you in, and so you won't even be able to walk. Throw them into the furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, was... in verse 20, but these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the fire, a blazing fire tied up. Oh, didn't read verse 22. For this reason, because the king's command was urgent, the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew these men who were carried up, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It got so hot, the guys 30 men were killed. So again, you're talking about dire circumstance. You're talking about certain death. You're talking about roasted alive, okay? Then verse 24, then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded, and he stood up in haste, and he said to his high officials, didn't we throw 3 guys in there? And he said, certainly we did. And he said, look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like the son of the gods. Now you have to look, and you can give a lot of reasons. Who is that? What is he seeing? Is he just seeing things? Now again, you look at this, that's an astounding, miraculous picture. Here's one I want you to hold on to. This is a miraculous work of God. I believe that what happened here is happened a number of times in the Old Testament. This is a pre-Christmas, pre-incarnate visage or vision of Jesus Christ himself. Back here, we have it a number of times in the Old Testament when Jesus made, because Jesus is eternal and Jesus is there. And you think, well, now, not only is that miraculous, but these guys, I thought they were tied up. And this fire was so hot, it wasn't just standing around a trash can burning someplace. This fire was so hot, it killed the guys, threw them in the fire. How in the world are they walking around? And that's when some people say, I'm sorry, I'd take a little detour here. That's not possible. That doesn't happen. Friend, let me again just talk about this idea of supernatural things we see in Scripture. When we see things like this, some people think that this is just it's a story. It didn't really happen. But think of this. If God is really who he says he is, if everything we see about God in Scripture, why shouldn't he do this kind of stuff? Miracles, setting aside supernatural laws, make entire sense if God is really God. They are perfectly consistent with the idea that God is who he says he is. So can he do this? Absolutely. So this miracle takes place. Didn't we see them walking around there? And then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king, and the high officials gather around and saw and regarded these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was a hair on their head singed, and nor were their trousers damaged, and nor they had the smell of and did not have the smell of fire on them. You know, you can't go to the beach and roast a hot dog and not come away smelling fire, right? Here, these guys been in the fire, came out without not even hair singed, not even smelling like smoke. Then Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angels to deliver them." Did God deliver them? Yes, he did. Absolutely, he did. And we think about that's absolutely consistent with other things we see in Scripture. We know, for instance, did God deliver Noah and his family from worldwide flood? Yes, he did. Did God deliver over 2 million Jews out of Egypt to take them to the promised land in Israel? Yes, he did. Did God cause the walls of Jericho to fall down outwards, not inwards? Yes, he did. How did he do it? You remember that story? So, okay, I tell you what, we're going to take this city called Jericho. I want you to march around it for 6 days, every day in a row. On the 7th day, I want all the priests to just blow on these ram's horns as loud as you can. And then I want you to all pray and the walls are going to fall down. You won't find that in a military strategy book. That's how they fell down. God delivered. God delivered Israel through Gideon. You remember that story? I love these stories. Gideon said, "Well, why do you want me to do this? I'm from one of the smallest tribes around. I'm not worthy." God said, "Well, I still want you to do it." He says, "Okay, you got an army. How about 20,000? God said, "Don't need them." How about 10,000? Don't need them. "Well, how many should I take?" "Go down, tell them it's time to get a drink, take them down to the brook, and watch the ones that bend down and get the water like this, scoop it up with their hands, but they're also watching around. Those are the ones I want you to take." "But there's only 300 of them." God delivered them. So, my friend, you're going to make a whole long list. Does God deliver? Yes, he does. God can deliver you. We need to say that's the God we serve. But now the last part of this. And here's a whole thrust of the message goes to this part. So God will deliver, they said, but if not. Verse 18. "And even if he does not, let it be known to you, king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Even if not." Listen, king, it doesn't matter how much you throw at us, how many people you say are doing it. Everybody else is doing it. Everybody's doing it. It doesn't matter how many fiery furnaces you're threatening with us with. It's not happening. We're not going to do it. Our God will deliver us, and even if not, we're not going to do it. Now, did God deliver them? Yes. Can he deliver? Yes. Will he deliver every time? That's the crux of the question. Think of these times in Scripture when God did not deliver his people. Remember Job? Job was the heaviest man. He was a righteous man. Heaviest man in the East means he was the most righteous man around. He lost his 10 kids. He lost his business. He lost his reputation. His wife said, "You're so miserable. Why in the world should you curse God and die?" We know that Paul was not delivered from a thorn in the flesh when he prayed 3 times for it to leave. We know that Jesus on the cross prayed, "God, I pray that this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done." And he went to his death. We know all the disciples suffered martyr's death. We know that Matthew was killed by a sword in Ethiopia. Mark was dragged through the streets of Alexandria. Luke was hanged from an olive tree in Greece. John was boiled in a cauldron of oil and somehow escaped that, and it was eventually exiled to Patmos. He's the only one that wasn't killed. Peter was crucified upside down in Rome. Andrew was bound to a cross and preached there until he died. James the Greater was beheaded in Jerusalem. James the Less was thrown from a pinnacle of the temple, and then he was beaten to death with a club. You go on and on. All the leaders, disciples, and other leaders, almost all of them were martyrs. They all died. Well, now, wait a minute. I thought our God delivers. I thought we're on his side, and he's obligated to deliver us. He did the 3 men there. So how are we to look at this? How are we to live in this land of, but if not? Isn't that appropriate? That didn't happen here, but Is there anything that gives us a broader context? Yes, it is. What happens? What happens when the chemo doesn't work? What happens when our kids abandon the faith? What happens when your husband walks out the door and never comes back? What happens when you lose your job? You ask all these questions, say, okay, where's God then? Those are good questions, they're frank questions, there's good questions. Let me just summarize, if I can, real quickly. 5 principles, 6 principles I read from Scripture, how we're to live in this land of but if not, okay? Number 1, here's a way I would apply this principle. We're to follow the facts, not our feelings. Galatians 2:20 says this, I have been crucified with Christ, and it's no longer I who live. But if Christ lives in me, in the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. My friend, do you realize that we're born in this world a spiritual, if we know Christ, we're born in this world spiritually dead, but come to know Christ, we're a spiritual dead man walking? Now think of this. Some of the leaders of the church, Polycarp, said this, listen, you're going to kill me? Will you kill me? Go to heaven. We need to live by the facts, not our feelings. I imagine these young men facing off against this fire furnace were probably, don't you think they were nervous? Don't you think they were afraid? Don't you think they were apprehensive? Yeah, I think they were. But they were willing to go there and not live by their feelings, but live by the fact that they said God's going to deliver them. Even if it doesn't make any difference, we're not going to bow. I remember years ago hearing a man by the name of Joseph Tson. He was a Romanian pastor in World War II. Many times he's called in for interrogation. And every time he went in, the more times they called him in, he said, I'm going to be killed. This is the day I meet my maker. One day he was called in, and I think I mentioned this to you before, but he asked his wife what I should do, and she said to him, go and die like a man. I said, well, that's one good wife we can count on. He went in the interrogation that time. Sure, he was going to be killed. And he prepared his things and went in. He said this, I have to tell you that, first of all, I'm ready to die. I put my affairs in order. And then he said this, your supreme weapon is killing. My supreme weapon is dying. Because when you kill me, people will see all over Romania, they will read my books and believe on the God that I preached, even more than they do now. And God will honor my dying more than my living. Now, they didn't kill him that time. That's a man who understood, I'm going to follow the facts, not my feelings. Here's the second principle. Second one, trust the process. We know that Job lost his kids. We know lost his business, his reputation, his wife. But in Job 2:10 it says this. He said to his wife, when his wife came, said, man, you're one miserable dude. Why don't the world just curse God and die? Get it over with. Here's what he said to her. He said, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. He trusted the process. Job didn't have the benefit of reading Job 1. He didn't know what God was doing, but he trusted the process. He had no idea that God was using him as an example to stand through the ages as somebody that would say, I'm going to trust God even though if I can't see all that he's doing. Even when the suffering may come and mount up, I'm going to trust him. Here's the third principle. Here's the third, and this is really critical, I think. Rejoice in the middle of trials. I don't mean get giddy happy and go around with some kind of fake smile on your face. You know you can rejoice without being happy? You can rejoice without being happy. Catch this one. Habakkuk 3, verse 17 says this. Here's what Habakkuk says. Though the fig tree should not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exult in the Lord, and I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. Read the book of Lamentations and read there what Jeremiah says in the middle of the people at that time under Nebuchadnezzar's siege when he came against Jerusalem. I mean, people were eating their own offspring because they'd run out of food. They were cannibalizing their own children. And yet Jeremiah said what? Your loving kindnesses are new every morning. Rejoice in the middle of your trials. I don't know what that means. I think it can mean reading things that are uplifting. I think it means listening to music. I think it means singing. I think it means doing things that help us rejoice. I think it means laughing, not in a spurious way. I just rejoice. Give thanks to God in the middle of trials. Fourthly, know that God works in weakness. Know that God works in weakness. 2 Corinthians 12:9. Over 40 years ago, I'm going to lunch in Huntington Beach with a pastor friend of mine. It's probably the equivalent of saying, maybe here from here to Walnut Creek is a little bit away. Didn't tell my secretary where I was going. So I'm just going to have lunch with this guy in Huntington Beach. Go down the freeway. I'm at a Coco's. I get a call. Are you John McNeff? Yeah. Your secretary wants you on the phone. Yeah, something's happened with your son. I get up. Said, your son's fallen in the pool. You need to get to the hospital. I raced up the hospital. This passage was ringing in my ears the whole way. I stopped the car, and you get in, okay, be under control, drive fast, but don't get a ticket. Passage this, he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I'm well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. My friend, God works through weakness. He loves working through weakness. Weakness is not a sign of defeat. Weakness just gives God more to work with. And we need to understand when we go through this time, God works through weakness. Fifth principle, trust the timing. 2 Peter 2, verse 9 says this, then the Lord knows how to rescue the ungodly from temptation and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge the flesh in corrupt desires and despise authority. My friend, God knows when and how and where he will judge, and he will. Maybe not in this world, but he will judge. We need to know that, trust that. And lastly, and I don't say this in a small way, my friend, we need to wait for the final victory. Wait for the final victory. Your victory may not be getting delivered from the fiery furnace on this earth. You may go through some of the things like Job did, like Paul did, like David did. You might go through some of those difficult times. And I said, God didn't deliver.